From Bowling Green State University and the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society, this is BG Ideas.
I'm going to show you this with a wonderful experiment.
You are listening to the Big Ideas podcast, a collaboration between the Institute for the Study of Culture and Society and the School of Media and Communication at Bowling Green State University. I am Valeria Grimberg-Pla, Profesora de Español and Latin American Cultural Studies at the World Languages and Cultures Department and your host for Big Ideas. As always, the opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of BGSU or its employees. Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated in the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. This land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, present and past, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. Joining us today are Carlos Andrés Gómez, award-winning Colombian American poet, author of Fractures, winner of the Felix Pollock Prize in Poetry, and Man Up, Reimagining Modern Manhood, published by Penguin Random House. Also joining us today is Amanda Anastasia Paniagua, Assistant Director for Belonging and Engagement at the Office of Multicultural Affairs, who is also earning her PhD in Higher Education Administration at BGSU. Thank you for joining us today, Carlos Andrés and Amanda. Carlos, tell us about your journey into poetry, acting, and the arts in general.
Thank you so much, first of all, for having us and for being here. It's amazing to be here on your beautiful campus and with all of you. So I would say the beginning of my journey was the day that the great Puerto Rican poet Martín Espada came to my high school when I was 17. I was living in Providence, Rhode Island at the time. My parents had split up and I'd left New York City living with my father. It's my birthplace, and went to live with my mother. And at this point in my life, being 17 years old, I very much thought of myself as an athlete. That was very much the identity that I connected to. I was a basketball player. I was not an artist. I was not a creative person. My older sister, Sarita, was the artist. She's, a sculptor, and she sketches and she paints. And in that time, it was very hard for me to envision being both those things at once. Thankfully, we live in a world where much more young people can see themselves as an artist and an athlete and many other things. And Martín Espada came to my high school and he read from his book, Imagine the Angels of Bread. And what none of my teammates on the basketball team, none of my friends knew was that I had been quietly writing poems for 6 months that I was having an identity crisis about and not showing to anyone. And as I sat in the back row of that auditorium in Providence, Rhode Island, and listened to Martín Espada, I just started weeping listening to his work. And it was the first time I'd heard poetry that felt like it was lifting pages out of the diary inside of my chest. And at the end of it, I walked up and I could only say one word. He said, he looked at me and, I bought a copy of his book and he saw my eyes all puppy. It was a mess. And he said, what's your name? I said, Carlos. And he took the book out of my hand and he wrote, Para Carlos, Poeta del Futuro, Martín Espada, and he handed me the book back. And it was like he looked into my soul and saw all the things I was terrified for the world to see. And he gave me permission. He opened a door to being an artist. I think that was the door that opened me to be a poet, to be a performer, to be an actor, to be a writer, to be all the other things that I do. And the beautiful full circle moment was almost exactly 20 years later, my first poetry book that was released, Hijito, he wrote the introduction to it. And then a year later, I was in conversation with him for the release of his book Floaters that won the National Book Award. So he's a cherished mentor that I've continued to stay in touch with, who's seen me from that 17-year-old kid to now an author and a poet and a father and all the other things that I am. So that is probably the best way to describe the door that opened for me into the world of art and being an artist and being a creative person. I think often in life, it's that person who sees something in you that you didn't know was there, or you didn't know you had the permission to reach toward, and he was that person, and he gave me that door.
Wonderful. I mean, I love this. He named you poet of the future, right? That's fantastic, and that you're still in touch, and he's still your mentor to this day. It's really beautiful. I was curious, how do you see art and activism intersecting, if at all, I mean? And if so, do you consider yourself an activist or even an artivist?
That's a great question, and it's interesting because I'm somebody who, I was a political activist, I should say, and was deeply involved in activism since I was, a child. I'm the son of, my father worked for the United Nations for many, many years and has worked in, human rights and advocating for living in a sustainable world and, combating climate change and all these things and advocating for clean water and doing all these things for decades. And my mother documents endangered languages, and she's a linguist and has worked in advocacy and trying to counteract deforestation of the Amazon and working with the Yanomami in the Amazon basin, Brazil-Venezuela border, just advocacy related to indigenous rights for decades. And my older sister, Sarita, who I mentioned before, has been an activist and done work related to maternal and child health and sexual and reproductive rights for women for decades, which is to say the examples I have in my family have made me know a truth that I feel when I think of the term activism. Everyone's an activist. What are you doing? Mm-hmm. That's the way I think about it. So people who think they are not active or what they are doing is not performing a kind of activism is activism, whether or not they want to. Everything we do has an outcome, has an impact. And I think that's very much tied to my praxis. I think everything that I write and everything I do is informing the world that I hope to live in. I think that's reflected through my writing. Someone now who has an MFA and has done stuff that's connected to the academy, with all the fraught implications of that, I think there are a lot of people who are tied to the academy who are very uncomfortable thinking about writing as something that is a political instrument. For me, I don't have any discomfort around that. I write to reflect the world that I see, and I write to be a window to the world that I hope for. And I feel like I'm sort of echoing several people, which I hope someone's going to jump in and help me with. What I just said has been inferred in different ways, from like bell hooks to Nina Simone to Toni Morrison to I'm missing other incredible Black women that have made me possible. But yeah, long way of saying I actually don't consider myself an activist in the sense that I think everything is activism. And because of that, it feels redundant. And I like to be a good editor. So I just think of myself as a poet and a global citizen. Thank you.
That's beautiful, beautiful. So Amanda, can you tell us about your PhD program and your research? And could you say that your scholarship is a form of activism, or what is the world you hope to see and maybe contribute to through your research, to put it in the words that Carlos Andrés had?
Well, yeah, it was a really great seg, the conversation around being tied to the academy and folks that would be very apprehensive to see their scholarship and research as a form of activism. But it's absolutely how I see it, especially when we think about those who have been historically discriminated out or priced out of these systems and these educational structures, right? I know my higher education in the United States history. I know what happened in the 1960s and the push from Black and brown student activists to say, hey, we want to study ideas and theories and histories that reflect our people and our communities. And not only do we want to study it, but we want it to be systematized in the academy. So it's all connected in my mind. So my particular research is looking at the socio-political context in which the post-baccalaureate achievement program was created in 1986. It was then subsequently renamed after the late Dr. Ronald E. McNair, who died in the 1986 Challenger explosion. What's interesting about this time is that the person who introduced the bill to rename that program was Strom Thurmond, If you know your American history, Strom Thurmond was a staunch segregationist. So for me, my inquisitive mind, that's an interesting historical question. What is a white politician doing wanting to rename a federal program that's just been created after a deceased Black man, other than to perhaps rehabilitate his white political career, right? And so using critical race theory as it was intended to be used in the scholarly academy way, and thinking about the way that race is still a salient social identity in the United States, it has been throughout time immemorial in the United States, and the 1980s are no different. So what does that mean in terms of activism? Well, it means that McNair Scholars Program still exists today. It's a federally funded TRIO program that exists on many campuses across the United States. So the research that I've done, there's very little on the effectiveness of the program. And I would argue that has a lot to do with ignoring the salient identities of the students that it was intended to serve. Because race matters, class matters, and gender matters when we talk about access and resources in education spaces. So yes, I want to echo what Carlos was saying about the tie to the academy. These institutions were never intended for certain communities. So once you are in them, the question becomes, what will you do with the resources and the access? And for me, it means giving back to my community. It means explaining these complex, nuanced ideas that I have access to in the classroom to folks that don't have access to college degrees, to help them see the world around them and maybe want to radically reimagine something that's better for all of us.
Beautiful. So, Carlos and Amanda, you are both open about your identities, and we are interested to learn the different ways your identity shows up for you in your quotidian lives. But to begin with, how do you think you embody your Latinidad?
I mean, that's a complex question for me. And I think of your poem, Carlos, like, what does a Latino look like? I mean, that poem was so powerful the first time I heard it, because I felt like you were speaking my entire life into existence, right? Folks around here, I grew up 30 minutes south of here. And, you know, growing up, Anglo folks were very clear to remind me that I was not one of them, right? And every expletive and epithet you can think of for Mexican American was hurled at me. And then when I went off to college, folks were very confused about my identity. I think I have what I like to call an ethnically ambiguous appearance in presentation. So I know who I am. I know my family's history. I know that we come from the fields and migrant work and migration, the Rossetto program in the 1940s. Like, I know my people's history, my family's history. So I know who I am. So my Latinidad is whatever I want it to be, right? And that's it. It's not for anyone else. It's for me. However, that being said, you know, I've heard comments like, oh, what are you? I don't know, a Martian? And then when I say, oh, you know, I'm of Mexican ethnicity, you know, descent, Spanish descent. Oh, you don't look Mexican. I'm sorry.
What does that mean, right?
All right, exactly, right. What does that mean? It means I don't look like the Mexican representation you have seen in the media.
Exactly.
Right? And that is a very curated, whitewashed, anglicized version of Mexican identity, or it's the far extreme of the stereotype. So because I don't fit into your neat little box and category, you don't know what to do with me. So there's that component. And then you add on the compounded layer of, you know, I can understand Spanish if it's spoken to me. I might be able to respond in like little snippets, but I don't speak it fluently. And that's not because of a lack of cultural pride. It's because my mom trusted the teacher in the education system when she told my mother not to teach my brothers and I Spanish because it would confuse us. Right. And so that's the first example of that systematic way that education spaces had erased a cultural remnant that then does have other Latinos questioning my Latinidad. Like, oh, you don't speak Spanish, you're not really Latino, right? Or Latina. Okay. You want to get really nasty about it? That's the colonizer's language. Mm-hmm. So none of us speak the indigenous language, honey. So I don't know why you're bragging. Like, so you know what I mean? Like, there's layers to it. So Latinidad is whatever you make it. Right? And that's yours to own and your story to own. And of course, having other folks that can speak to certain experiences helps, right? Having the art, having the poetry. But ultimately, we are the authors of our own understanding of ourselves. And, you know, we can be in community with others to help grapple with what does it mean to have an identity in the United States, right? Particularly around that Mexican identity that has historical border issues, right? Borders crossed us, we didn't cross them, right? The Chicano identity is a highly political term. I like the word Chicano better because it reflects that reality of like, not quite Mexican enough for Mexican people, not quite American enough for American people. I am who I am, right? Bicultural. I know who I am. There's really not a word that encompasses it, but Chicana is the best that I got right now.
Thank you.
I resonate so much, as you know, with so much of that. I'm not Chicano, but I have a lot of Chicano, Chicana, Chicanekis friends who, and I think just something, there's so much in there that I think resonates with my experience, but even that idea of the liminality you're talking about, that I think is an outcome of colonial violence and assimilationist violence and the kind of violences that happen within our communities that so many of us are not excavating or thinking deeply about because we're not taught to by design. That's part of the systematic violence. English is my third language.
Okay.
And now my strongest language. And I think about, as the son of a linguist who I joke speaks 6 languages better than any language I will ever speak. I'll never have good enough grammar in any language for her. Everyone in my family speaks many, many languages. You know, my first languages were Spanish and Portuguese. When I was 6 months old, I moved to Brazil. And I think about so many things with your story. You know, when I was 5 years old, I didn't speak any English, and neither did my older sister, Sarita. And my father panicked because we were living abroad, and he was like, oh no, they don't speak English. They're going to have to endure what I went through. Because when he moved here when he was 13 from Colombia, he didn't speak a word of English, like nobody in his family. And then you know what the solution was, right? They said, oh, you'll learn English. We're just going to throw you in a school, and then you'll figure it out. And you can imagine how that worked out. And he lived in Miami. Exactly. But people think of Miami now, or like where my family lives in Aventura, North Miami Beach. You know, my abuelita lived there for 63 years and didn't learn a word of English because she lived in Aventura. You know what I mean? Like, it's all Colombians and a few Cubans tossed in, you know? But that's not what Miami was in 1961. In 1961, there were some, you know, Cubans that had come over, but they were very much in their own enclave. That's not where my father and his family lived, and his sisters. And so he went to school, and what happened? He just failed out. People called him dumb. He failed out, and then what did he do? He cut school to go surfing because he had made some friends who didn't want to go to school. He was like, this sounds great. Why would I want to go to school? And surfing was a way he could make friends where he didn't have to talk because you're out on the waves. And if somebody lends you a surfboard, and so that's what he did for most of high school. And I don't know how he ended up graduating high school, but somehow he did eventually. But I think that him enduring that explains the complexity of my language. So I lost all of my Portuguese, much of my Spanish. I got much of my Spanish back, lost some of my Spanish. I have a very complicated relationship with language, but people are very rarely saying, oh, I want to hear that whole story about why your fluency with Spanish is not where it is in English.
Right.
Nobody wants to have patience or have that discussion. But to answer more directly the question about Latinidad, I think that's so powerful and also complex and interesting about identity is identity and our relationship to our many identities, I think, evolve over time. And also, they're also in terms of relationship in all these different ways. So, for example, I'm, Colombian American, Latino, Latine, Latinx, whatever. I don't identify as Hispanic, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Yes, okay.
But
I'm right there with you.
But I was gonna say this. I'm also the father of my children, who are Black and Colombian. So that's something that's reflected through my work. So a lot of my work is reflecting on the children that I'm raising with my partner, who's a Black American woman, and that becomes something that's critical to understanding my identity. Because I'm not just a father, I'm a father trying to raise, Black Colombian children in the America that we currently are in. And me also reflecting on how the identity that I have is distinct from my kids and distinct from my wife. Like, all of us have distinctive identities. And so thinking about that is something that I'm always wrestling with in my work. So that's a very long way of saying, when I consider my Latinidad, there are many, many things that I'm going to constantly be excavating and wrestling with. One is thinking about colorism. When I think about Latinidad, think about
the anti-Blackness.
Think about anti-Blackness. thinking about the Black Indigenous erasures that are consistently being performed, thinking about ways that I'm both, that I'm also have tremendous structural power and leverage because of the way that I present. And a complicated wrinkle to this is just about the, I think, ubiquity of how white supremacy is performed and actually exists in the world. But then I apply for a mortgage loan, and I always joke, I say, for obvious reasons, you don't send a headshot with a mortgage loan. So I encounter tremendous discrimination trying to get a mortgage loan. I tell people the story. They're like, why did you go through all that? And well, all he had was Carlos Andrés Gómez with the mortgage loan. Exactly. Or like why, the big joke is a story I often tell, thinking about identity, thinking about the greater identities we hold. My wife has a name that is not culturally or ethnically marked at all, but she's, a petite Black woman who often has her hair in an afro. You know what I'm saying? So when you see her, there's people have a very clear idea about her racial identity often, which is often the presumption is correct. When we applied to rent an apartment in New York City, this is when we were first moving in together in Brooklyn, wires got crossed. We each thought the other partner was going to, we were using Craigslist, reach out to the, I think we were emailing, I don't know, we used Craigslist or something like that to email the apartments. We each emailed the 12 apartments we'd narrow down. So she gets 9 emails back within an hour, sets up 5 appointments. I don't get 1 email back. So all they have is just the name, And so I was like, God, that's so strange. I didn't get any emails back. And so she shows up to the first apartment, and they say, they literally meet her through, like, can I help you? And she was like, yeah, I'm here to see I'm so sorry. We just rented the apartment 10 minutes ago. I'm so sorry. Yeah. And then she goes to the second apartment, and they go, I should have called you. I'm so sorry. We just rented the apartment 10 minutes ago. And by the fourth apartment, she was like, oh, what a coincidence. And so it's one of those things where we ended up having, she would do the email and then I'd show up and then all the apartments were available. So thinking,
horrible.
Thank you, Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins, right. Thinking of the intersectional ways that our identities, actually exist in this world we live in.
But look at you all using that navigational capital, right, to navigate those structures and know how to get one over on those racist and sexist landlords.
Yeah. And I mean that's a survival impulse.
100%.
It's a survival because it is too. How can you prove? They're like, no, we rented it 10 minutes ago. I don't have subpoena power. I can't prove that he actually read.
Yeah.
I know that's a really long answer, but that's the shortest answer I could give to begin to scratch the surface about my relationship to my Latinidad. The last thing I'll say, because I really have been talking for a long time, is something I say to young people in particular all the time, is I say the thing that I feel is most powerful about my Latinidad and powerful about any of the identities we inhabit is we have the power as husbands and partners and citizens and friends and professors and students and everything to decide what are the traditions we want to continue, what are the traditions we want to remake, and what are the traditions we want to end. And I think about that all the time. I'm very, very proud to be Colombian. There's a lot of things that are going to die with me or the generation above, things that I'm not going to continue. And to me, when I think about Latinidad, I think about the possibility and the power of being able to do that in this life.
And tell me, Carlos, in your poem, Where Are You Really From? You write, I am from a place beyond place. So how do you think place has affected the way you exist in your world?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to the question of liminality that we were talking about before. It's like the classic, yo soy ni de aquí ni de allá, or the sort of reclamation is yo soy de aquí y de allá, which I think is very subversive.
Right,
exactly.
Yes.
But it's like I go to Colombia and it's like, okay, I'm the gringo in Colombia in Bogota, and then here I'm the immigrant's kid Colombian. You know what I mean? And feeling like, I lived in so many different places. I've bounced around a lot growing up, but there were so many people, especially as a young person, which is harder when you don't have the political orientation or the language or the history, where people are constantly telling you who you are.
Oh, yeah.
And people are very rarely, especially in this country, people are very rarely asking you or with genuine curiosity. And if they do ask you, it's like the thing you say. It's like the invisible checklist. Like, how well do you dance cumbia? Like, how well do you speak Spanish? Like, can you cook empanadas from scratch? I'm like, who are you? Can you? Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
But it's one of those things, I think, for me, where I think my identity is a much more expansive concept than just being tied to place. I've had many people who've said, have you lived in Colombia? Were you born in Colombia? Like, no. I've been to Colombia many times, but even if I never had been, I mean, I have tons of Nuyorican Boricua friends in New York who have never been to Puerto Rico and will never go. That doesn't make them not connected to La Isla. You know what I mean? That doesn't make them not connected to their Puerto Ricanness. And they've even remade a new identity in New York, which is why you have a concept like Nuyorican. There's a lot of people I grew up with through the Nuyorican Poets Cafe. So, I mean, a lot of that is just trying to challenge this idea, the very literal idea of an attachment to place, which is a deeply colonial concept and a deeply white supremacist concept. Like, people are like, were you born in Mexico? You know what I mean? Have you been there? And it's like, well, let's talk about the history of Mexico and those borders.
Okay, yeah, right. Let's start there. Yeah.
Which is a conversation. People say, what are you talking about? It's like the border constraints today are not what they have always been. And there's so much to unpack and peel back there. So for me, I think that's just trying to challenge people in particular to more expansively consider our attachment to identity as something that is untethered to a plot of land that somebody literally or figuratively stuck a flag in.
Amanda, what does the Office of Multicultural Affairs here at BGSU do to deal with the type of assumptions behind the question, where are you really from?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak for the office. I can only speak from my personal lived experience. So if someone were to ask me that specific question, I think for myself, I would respond and say, my family is from here. They migrated here to work in the fields because that's what resources were available to them. And my ancestors are from what is now Nuevo León, Mexico. My mom's side is from what is now Brownsville, Texas, that used to be Mexico. Before that, it belonged to the indigenous peoples of the land. So where are you really from? I'm born in the United States. I'm from Northwest Ohio, right? So I like what you said about this tie to the land, this tie to place is very much a colonial concept. However, right, it's also central and tied to indigenous ways of knowing, this sense of place, the sense of tie to the land, that you cultivate and you take care of the land, and you're a good steward of the land and you're a good steward of the earth, right? That's a very different approach when we think about a tie to a land. So I just want to be careful not to construe that a sense of place can always be colonial in its approach, right? And to think about what would it be to take an indigenous standpoint, an indigenous way of knowing. And I think that's another thing that we don't really talk about Latinidad, right? And that those who are categorized as Latino in the United States once belonged to an indigenous group of people that had their own culture, their own language, their own worldviews. And those identities have been stripped away over time through assimilation tactics, through colonialism. So I am so far removed from my indigeneity, but like that indigenous identity runs through the Americas, not just North America, Central and South America. So I think, again, having access to education spaces to wrestle with these histories is so vitally important for our communities, because we then, if we don't have access, we internalize the colonial mindset of asking, well, where are you really from? Where were you born? As though that defines who you are and will continue to define who you will be in the world. There's a very U.S.-centric way of thinking, because I think about our international student population, right, who also have tremendous ties to their homelands and ought to be able to be proud of that. And like, it means one thing when you ask it to a domestic person of color in the United States, and then it means a completely different thing when you ask it to an international student, and it borders on xenophobia for me, right? And so, again, that's a question that if asked to me personally, I know how I would respond. As an office, I think we do a really good job of making sure that all folks feel welcome in all of our spaces, and that we would hope that if students encountered a question like that that felt inauthentic or aggressive in some way, that they would report it, right? See it, hear it, report it, and inform some of us professional staff so that we can hold space for that student to feel seen and feel affirmed in whatever identity they choose to want to be affirmed in that moment.
I just want to say thank you for that contextualization and also that reframe and also check on what I said about the connection to the land. 100% agree with that. And also to be clear, I think of, for example, the indigenous people my mother works with in the Amazon. The idea is not like ownership of the land. It's like stewards of the land, right? And when people often, I think, are asking me like connections to my tie to place, they very much mean it in the colonial, capitalistic ownership way. Not like deep ties to a shared place that is stewarded by folks who are indigenous to this space in a sacred way. It's more like, do you rent or do you own?
Right.
It's very much like, let me see your passport. It's very much like, can't wait to pull that flag out and wrap myself in it. I don't feel like my pride about my Colombianness has nothing to do with the nation state of Colombia.
Okay. Yes.
just to be clear, you know what I mean? Like
same.
Like I am a U.S. citizen. I'm a New Yorker. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like I'm not abroad with an American flag wrapped around me, obviously. From my baby's been listening to anything I've been saying right now. But I think I love really important what you said. And I just think also to that nuance of who's asking a question, understanding the sort of value ideological framework that is implied. You know what I mean? It's not like a Lakota elder who's asking me a highly fraught question about place, about my ties to a place. It's unfortunately maybe a white professor at a school in rural Ohio. You know what I mean? And there might be a very different ideological underpinning to where the question comes from, a very different history attached to it. But again, I think one of my favorite things about writing in general as a political tool is it ultimately being a catalyst of this. Because I think about how many layers we've peeled back, and you took an excerpt of literally one line there. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm drawn to art as this kind of catalyst, because I don't know that the essays absolutely can do this and other kind of writing, but I don't know something that can as concisely be a vehicle for this kind of potent excavation. So I'm just kind of geeking out. That's what I love. That's my bias toward poetry.
No, I feel you. I also write poetry, so I understand. It's a good palate cleanser from all the academic writing.
Yes.
We are going to take a quick break. Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas podcast.
Question. Answer. Discussion.
If you are passionate about big ideas, consider sponsoring this program. To have your name or organization mentioned here, please contact us at ics@bgsu.edu.
Welcome back to the Big Ideas podcast. Today, I am speaking with Carlos Andrés Gómez, Colombian American poet, author, and actor, and Amanda Anastasia Paniagua, Assistant Director for Belonging and Engagement at the Office of Multicultural Affairs and PhD student in Higher Education Administration at BGSU. Carlos, in Manap, Reimagining Modern Manhood, your coming-of-age memoir, you address issues pertaining to expectations that stem from societal masculinity versus vulnerability. Can you talk more about these notions, where they come from, and what's your role in deconstructing them?
That's a big and really important question. I think my impetus to write my memoir, Man Up, Reimagining Modern Manhood, basically came from growing up in a very violent machismo culture where I felt like I had very little permission to be the person that I actually am, which is a tender-hearted, vulnerable, emotional, sensitive, collaborative, highly verbal, curious person. And when I was growing up, all those qualities were feminized. And I say feminized in the sense that they were categorized as being associated with the feminine, associated with girls and women, and by default, something that were very much understood to me as things that I was not allowed to espouse, because anything that was associated with feminine was communicated to me as less than, was communicated to me as absolutely unacceptable for me as a boy, and also something to be devalued, which is something obviously we continue to see in a world that is patriarchal and misogynistic and sexist. And so I think for me, so much of my childhood was me feeling like I couldn't be the person I was. And that was very, very painful and difficult for much of my life, but it became unbearable. And I think quite literally life-threatening by the time I got to 16 or 17 years old. And I built this kind of performative construct of myself that became a prison of sorts. And, you know, in many ways, I was lucky to have people like Martina Espada open that door, and partners, and my older sister Sarita, and my mother, and some other people who I think quite literally saved my life. But the book was trying to analyze and understand that journey of me at 6 or 7 years old, realizing the person that I am is not acceptable, so I need to build myself into the opposite. And then how I sort of tried to find my way back after building myself into this sort of toxic machismo cartoon by the time I was 16 or 17 years old. And it's obviously an ongoing process. The process has never ended. I still am wrestling with all the toxic, fraught narratives I was taught to internalize. But I think for me, it's knowing this question of people telling you who you're supposed to be is never something that we should ever receive. As much as we're taught to internalize that, that's probably the greatest central, message of the book, is just wherever you reside on the gender continuum, wherever you reside on any identity continuums, trying to carve out permission for us to claim our fullest, best, most authentic selves in a world where there are constantly people, there are constantly systems, cultural ideas, traditions that are trying to force us to be people that we are not. Looking at the irony in this, coming full circle in many ways, the most vital tools for me as a father to 2 kids, as a husband, as a partner, as an artist, as an educator, are all those characteristics I was taught to be ashamed of and taught that I couldn't access. Like if I couldn't be emotionally literate, if I couldn't be tender, if I couldn't be nurturing, if I couldn't be accountable, if I couldn't be sensitive, if I couldn't be all these things that I was told you can't embody these as a boy or as a man, I would absolutely not be able to be a good father or a good husband or a good friend or a good teacher or a good artist. So that's something I think about a lot. And just the last thing I'll say really quickly is I think, the front line and the back line of dismantling patriarchy and sexism and rape culture and all the things that I think all of us are forced to live in a world that is, you see those things ubiquitously replicated across all these different points of navigation. The front line and the back line is the home. A friend of mine, great Egyptian feminist, scholar, activist, Mona El-Tahawy says, the home is the front line because all dictators go home. Mm-hmm. I think about that all the time. What I'm modeling to my kids, how I'm being a husband and a father, how I'm modeling relationships, how I'm modeling roles in those small ways that are not curated and put on social media, that are not put on big public forums. If you go to my social media, you're not going to see me performing fatherhood. I just am a father. You know what I mean? And I'm not doing it for an audience. I'm doing it for the people that are closely tied to me. And so I think about that a lot. Like the most powerful place that I will dismantle these things that horrify me, these idea systems, these socialized and acculturated ways of being, are in my home, for my kids, with my partner. I know that's a long explanation, but that's the most concise way I can answer a huge, urgent, and multidimensional question. Thank you for that.
As a Latina in a position of leadership, how do you think, Amanda, these notions of masculinity versus vulnerability have affected you in your work, and how do you address them?
So I think I have a different take because I am the eldest Latina daughter, which is, if you know, you know. If you don't know, listen to Surface Pressure from the movie Encanto, and that will tell you the constant feel of responsibility and pressure to be the leader, to be the successful one, to hold the family together, to be the glue, right? Like that's a lot of pressure. I have a lot of masculine energy is what I like to say, right? I use she, they pronouns because some days, I feel more femme. Other days I'm like, I don't get down with this female identity. I just can't because it's so socially limiting, right? Just like you felt that pressure to perform this caricature of masculinity, I also have felt the pressure to perform this caricature of femininity. And so being a Latinx individual in a space of power and privilege in a lot of ways, I try to model for the students what it means to take up space as your authentic self, right? As my queer, authentic self, right? Low-key corporate goth. Today is a mild goth day, but, right, I got my shirt on that says weird pero bonita, right? So, like, and it's true. Like, I am absolutely weird. I like true crime documentaries. I like dark things. I like the occult, right? So, and I don't want to have to apologize for who I am. And I like what Carlos said earlier. The most radical thing you can do in a society that will tell you constantly who they think you should be, the most radical, revolutionary thing you can do is to love yourself and love what you see in the mirror, because that is dangerous to people in power. Because when you have a love for yourself, you have self-autonomy and self-determination in a system that would rather you fall into line and be placated by stuff and consumption. I'm much more interested in building community with the students I work with every day, with my colleagues, my peers. So I think vulnerability is a human emotion and emotive response to a broken world. To say, I too am hurting in this moment for whatever reason. And in this moment, I see you and I have love for you and I'm going to hold space for you. And I don't think that should be dictated by what somebody's gender is that day or how they have been identified at birth, right, by a medical community. I think that should just be, vulnerability should be a human trait that we extend to one another in moments of crises and moments of grief, but also in moments of joy and celebration for one another.
In your poem, What Latino Looks Like, you write, my name is 3 words. They can't be abbreviated. Yeah, I want you to remember all 3. So, Carlos, what else do you want people to remember you by?
More than anything, I mean, I think closing that poem like that, I think it's for anybody who has a very common name, maybe in a place they have some connection to, and their name is consistently misspelled, mispronounced, substituted out for another name, which happens constantly. And I always joke, I say I have like the most common first, middle, and last name in Colombia. My name is like John Doe Smith, but I come to the United States and everyone's like, Carlos Gonzalez? Carlos? I've had people make beautiful posters to bring me out, paid me a lot of money, and then I have like a new name. But yeah, it's for anybody who has experienced that, I mean, more than anything, what do I want to be remembered by? Honestly, the thing I most want to be remembered by is, I don't think it's really about me. I hope that people remember that I saw them, that I received and celebrated them in their multiplicity. That's what I want to be remembered by. Like, I don't plan to live forever. I don't want to live forever. I don't need to live forever. I don't need like a statue made. I think it's enough the kind of energy that I've shared with people that I encountered across my life. And if that energy can be carried forward in a positive way, that's the thing that I hope is the kind of memory that is maintained. It doesn't need to be connected to literally me, but I hope that the energy is memorialized and carried forward in that beautiful sort of karmic way. That's the only memory I'm concerned with.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Amanda? What should people know or remember about you?
I think I would echo what Carlos said. I want to be remembered. I mean, the ultimate compliment to me when I move on to the next journey in this existence would be standing room only at my wake and my celebration of life. Because I don't want a funeral. I want people to party, right? I want people to dance. I want people to
Yes.
eat, to sing, to get down, to hook up, like have a good time,
Yes.
right? Because you only get one life, as far as I know. So I want to be remembered as somebody who brought joy, who brought some education, right? I'm an educator at heart, who brought laughter, who brought joy, who brought spirit, a little sassiness, right? A little sexiness, right? All of it, right? I want to be remembered for all of the joy that I brought to people's lives and the challenge, right? The good kind of challenge that I might have brought to the way that they thought, because to me that will be a life fulfilled. And I really loved what you said about it starting in the home. Man, my partner, if he were here, he'd be snapping his fingers so hard, because we say the same thing all the time. It starts with our children and bringing them up to be an empathetic, loving generation to their peers and to model that humanity to one another, but to know who they are so that they can challenge folks who want to tell them who they are or who they think they should be. So yeah, I want to be remembered as somebody who brought joy and as somebody who raised other good humans.
I have one last question for both of you. So, Carlos, what advice would you give Latinx people interested in a career as poets or performers?
That's a great question. It's a question I actually often get, and there's two pieces of advice I always give people that I think have been most vital to me to being, at this point, I've been a full-time artist. It'll be 19 years on June 1st, my 20th anniversary next year, which is wild. There are two things that made my life possible as a full-time artist. Not that people have to be a full-time artist to be a poet or a performer. Two critical pieces. The first one is community. People always talk about, they always say, writing is a solitary activity. People sit in a cabin. I think that's like a widely replicated falsehood from the academy, if I may say so. Because I didn't grow up in that community. I came up in the New York Poets Cafe. I came up, you brought something you wrote on the subway, and you have people sitting on your feet in a place packed with, with fire code is 146, and there are 370 people packed in there on a Friday night. And someone spills a beer on you as you're walking up to read this poem. I always grew up around a really vibrant community, and so I think part of it is having a strong community. I know not everyone lives in a place like New York City, so maybe in Bowling Green, Ohio, it's different. A community can be one person you exchange a poem with every week or two. That can be a community. A community can be one other person, but it has to be a person that challenges you as much as they nurture and support you, and somebody you deeply trust. And that's not necessarily an easy thing to find, but it can be one person, it can be two people, And then the second thing too is just getting out there and doing it consistently is just repetition. Everything is repetition. Everything I've done is from thousands and thousands of repetitions. And so I think finding a space, and that may be connected to the community, which is a place where you can go out and do this. And maybe it's a intersection of those two things, which it was for me. I went to 3 open mics a week for probably 14, 15 years in New York City. And I think of how much I was challenged and supported and nurtured by just getting out there. And people didn't want to hear the same poem. They're like, no, what's the new thing you wrote? Or people like, I had people who were 10 years older than my mentors, and they say, here's a book. I need it back next Monday. I'm going to ask you about it. And I was like, oh, damn, I guess I got to read this book. You know what I mean? And that was how, that was like my first 2 MFAs that nobody recognizes was, Rachel McKibbins, was, Lynn Prokop, was, all these mentors I had, Ross Gay and Araceli Esquitamay and all these people I was just in community with in New York City. And so those are the two things I would say. You got to get out there and do it. And that might be an open mic. It might be a poetry slam. It might be a thing you set up, a salon that you set up where you get out and you share new work with a few friends. And the first part of it's got to be finding a community, a consistent community. You do those two things and you never stop, and you never, ever, ever stop. I promise you will grow, and you will develop tools as a writer, as a performer, as an artist.
Mm-hmm. And Amanda, what advice would you give to students researching about identity and issues of inclusion?
I would say keep doing it. Keep doing the work. Keep doing the reading and the research, especially now as we're living through another civil rights movement that is tied to the epistemological fight to have access to knowledge and to histories, to have access to it, to teach it, and to produce it. So if you are examining identity, don't stop. I would also echo the importance of community. The Academy likes us to think that in this scarcity mindset that there's only so many resources and so much funding to go around, and that may be true, right? The funding may be limited, but think about what you can do as a collective in pulling resources together, pulling funding, pulling people onto projects, reaching out to trusted mentors and faculty like, hey, can I come present with you at a conference or like, hey, do you know anything that's coming up in the pipeline? It's really important to establish that network and community of scholars that you can trust to share your work, to share your writing, to get that critique back, and folks that are going to trust, that you can trust to not steal your ideas, or if they do borrow your ideas, that they cite you and they give you proper kudos, right, and proper shout outs for that academic integrity. So again, I can't stress it enough, especially if you're first gen and came from a low income background and you're the first in your family to go to college. You need to finish. You absolutely need to finish. It took me 7 years, but the lifelong earnings that you will gain for yourself and for your future family and for future generations is so vital, especially now while we're going into a new era where I don't know where the investment for higher education in this country is going to come from, and that these institutions are going to get even more chilly and volatile if something doesn't happen soon.
Carlos and Amanda, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with other ICS happenings by following us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. You can listen to Big Ideas wherever you find your favorite podcasts. Please subscribe and rate us on your preferred platform. This script was researched and written by Miles Kell. Sound engineering was provided by Brendan Achetura and Marco Mendoza. This episode was recorded in the Falcon Radio studio. We thank the faculty advisor for WBGU-FM, Phil Beskid, for his support.